Patrick, thanks for joining us on RT International. Give us some insight on, well, the pretty confusing stuff going on in the economy right now as a result of this result. London stocks, the pound are plummeting. That was, of course, predicted by the Remain campaigners. How long is that going to last? Will we see a rebound anytime soon, do you think?
Very, very interesting because, of course, one of the things that we've seen here is there's a certain gut reaction. People have suddenly gone, oh my goodness, we didn't expect this to happen because, of course, vast numbers of the banking industry were entirely in favour of staying in the European Union, largely because they often sell fabulously dodgy products to European governments, if you're someone like Goldman Sachs, and therefore suddenly this came as a shock reality. What we're seeing right at the moment is a huge tail-off. Instantly the pound dropped quite graphically, but here's the twist. Financial investors might not feel that comfortable buying the pound right at the moment, but in fact, if you look at exports, the lifeblood of the economy, suddenly British exports look wonderfully cheap. And that's a fantastic moment for the British economy, because in fact, earlier in the week, long before we saw this collapse, already the pound was cheap against the euro. It was cheap against Germany. It was very cheap against Mediterranean countries like France and Italy and Spain. And that's only become even better. The pound now is at a point where Britain can have an export boom. And if Britain can have an export boom, if its products are more competitive, it's going to sell more stuff overseas. If it's going to sell more stuff overseas, then ultimately the economy is going to go better. If the economy goes better, there'll be no doubt whatsoever the pound is going to start coming back up.
OK, Patrick, so perhaps some positives to the currency situation. What about the job market, though? Perhaps not quite so positive. We're hearing that the American investment bank Morgan Stanley may have already started relocating 2,000 jobs from London to Dublin and Frankfurt. The fears are more will follow. What do you think?
OK, two things. First of all, the United Kingdom essentially has half the unemployment of France. That was one of the core reasons why ultimately people voted to leave the European Union, because the Eurozone is a basket case where it's incredibly difficult to employ people, and ultimately, therefore, they have very high unemployment as a result of their appalling economies. What you're seeing at the moment is just politicking. You're seeing banks putting a feeler out. They're thinking about moving some staff from A to B because actually it's cheaper. That's all they're doing. It's labour market arbitrage. They're concerned that it might be more difficult to do later when the UK has actually left the overall European Union. So therefore they're trying to get in now. They're trying to show a certain degree of solidarity with the remains of the European project as it smoulders in Brussels at this juncture, shocked as it is by the overall departure. But realistically, look at it this way. What happened after the crash in 2008? Lots of job losses right across the European continent. What happened from 2011 onwards? Because the British economy was flexible, more investment took place in the United Kingdom, and therefore British unemployment dropped from the same sort of levels in Europe back to around where we are now, 5%. Think about it this way as well. At the moment, the United States, something like 22% of their total overseas investment in the entire world is in the UK. It amounts to a vast number, something like $22 trillion. They're not about to take all that money away tomorrow. They might trim a little bit at the edges. They might say that they're going to do this and that and the other. But ultimately, remember a simple statistic. Every man, woman, child, pensioner, even the unborn in Frankfurt would have to work in financial markets, the whole population, just to get close to how many people work today just in the City of London and not in the other major financial entities throughout the course of the UK.
OK, Patrick, you seem to have the currency covered, the jobs covered. I'm going to have to play devil's advocate with you, though, a bit and talk about the subsidies, because economists are saying some of the regions that voted for the leave option in that referendum were the most dependent on the EU for subsidies, some of the regions in Wales, perhaps. So surely that's cutting off your nose to spite your face.
Well, let me put it to you this way. Does it really make a lot of sense to give some money into a central pot in Brussels which has failed its audit for the course of the last 20 years, which ultimately, if it were a private company, the people would be locked up and sent to jail, and quite rightly too, because these people are more corrupt than the banksters. They then recycle that with 1,500, if not 15,000 people who earn more than the British Prime Minister and send it back to a small village in North Wales. Does that strike you as a useful use of this money? I don't think so. I think Britain is much better off distributing its own funds, being allowed to have a freedom to manage to let these villages prosper once again. And let's face it, some of these places, the reason they're getting EU funds in the first place is because the EU destroyed their livelihoods. Fishing villages in the UK, all sorts of other industries where the EU gave grants in order to move the production outside of the UK to other countries. So actually, that's a slightly fallacious argument overall. The truth is, recycling British money via Brussels is very inefficient. What we want to see, and what we're going to see, is a proper, dynamic United Kingdom that's going to move forward and spend its own money without having to listen to the demigods of a bureaucracy who cannot understand the needs of the people.
This is all very comforting to hear, but I'm not sure if we need these soothing tones, because it's Mark Carney to the rescue. The Bank of England governor is going to steady the markets, he says. He's going to release £250 billion into the system. If you know where that comes from, please tell me. I'm fascinated to know. Will it steady the ship, though, is the main question.
Let's put it this way. What he's doing at the moment is he's on manoeuvres. I mean, essentially, he's going to use a sort of artificial money pot in order to manage to make sure that there aren't any huge inflows, outflows that ultimately imbalance, create a disequilibrium in the short term. That's quite a common thing to do overall in the general business of money per se. It sounds like a massive number, but that's just because economies are massive numbers. What is, of course, very interesting is all of a sudden we've seen 2 weeks ago the former Goldman Sachser, Mark Carney, was telling us that this was the end of the world. A few weeks ago, Mrs. Lagarde, the woman of the IMF, who used to always tell us that Britain was economically mismanaged for the last 5 years, was telling us, oh my goodness, you know, this is all a complete crisis if you leave. Now, all the blob has come back in and they've all gone, oh, absolutely nothing to see here, nothing to worry about. In fact, I grabbed a couple of hours sleep this morning, and if you remember, David Cameron said Brexit was going to cause the Third World War. Well, clearly I must have missed it. It was so short. It must have taken place just before 10 o'clock this morning. It's a fascinating old world, isn't it? You see the blob coalesce back around. Ultimately, yes, we are in a volatile world. Ultimately, yes, this is going to be a brave and interesting new horizon. But realistically, is that something utterly incredible that the 5th largest economy in the world cannot cope with? Of course not. And that's why I'm optimistic today, because there are going to be rough seas ahead, but it's much, much better being out there, sailing free, than it is to be shackled to the iceberg, which is the Titanic of Brussels.
OK, Patrick, and just very briefly, looking to the future now, obviously the big question is what happens next in terms of the UK's relationship with the EU. We saw Boris Johnson today saying it will always be a close partner with the EU, a great power within the continent. What kind of relationship will Britain have to build? Will we have a similar relationship to the Norway model, perhaps, with beneficial trade pacts, or have we annoyed too many EU members now for them to cut us any slack as a result of this referendum?
I think the best model to look at is Richard North has defined Flexit. It's a fascinating paper. It should be downloaded by everybody. It should be sent to every home in the European Union. That explains how things may go forward. It may be something like a Norwegian model. We're obviously going to see the negotiations. They're going to take at least 2 years. Article 50 has to be invoked and so on. But let's just look at the relationship with Europe. Britain has said it wants a divorce from a single European superstate. Doesn't want that. It wants to be on cordial, free trading, excellent terms with the world, particularly the partners in Europe with whom it's grown so close, particularly in the last 50, 60 years. And let's understand it in one sentence. If the European Union wants to play tough, wants to cut Britain off, then it's mutually assured destruction, because ultimately the Eurozone economies need to export to Britain much, much more so than the British Isles need to deal with the European Union.
OK, Patrick Young, global financial markets expert, shedding some light on what are quite a lot of questions about this whole referendum business. Patrick, thanks for joining us here on RT International. Great to have you with us today.